Yes. Okay, there we go.
There you
Good
go.
evening. Good evening, everyone.
Hello.
Great to
evening.
have you here.
Good evening.
I'm looking forward to learning together tonight. I'm not sure how much time we're going to end up with for the Aggadah portion. We'll see how the evening goes, how the next hour and change. We'll see how it goes. We'll certainly touch on it, but as I will get to when I touch on it, I think you'll start to get an understanding of why I'm a little more comfortable in the halachic sections than I am in the Aggadah sections, and I will and that's part of the introduction to what the Aggadah is. But we did end up last time with this is pretty impressive. Here we are, fourth session, and we still have 16 squares, and 2 of them are doubled up. That's not bad. That's not bad. I gotta say, I'm really, really happy. Thank you all very much for giving me this opportunity. So what I want to do tonight for the first portion of the evening is dive back into some stuff that we started to touch on last night, which is really I would say in a certain very real sense, our first foray into actually studying Gemara, actually studying Talmud. This is what we started doing last week. And I want to give ourselves a chance to engage in that in a fuller way, because as I think I've mentioned, you can't really understand what Gemara, what Talmud study is about without actually studying Gemara. It just doesn't. Any explanations that I've ever heard or managed or tried to offer fall woefully short and remind me of, I don't know, trying to explain to a blind person what a color looks like. It's just not, until you actually see it. It's just it doesn't. You're not really there. You don't really get it. And frankly, until you're really studying together in the same room, I think you don't really get it either. But God willing, hopefully things are headed in the right direction in that regard, and we'll be able to do that at some point in the future, those who are still interested. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through, well, let me do this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the sources that we began last week. I'm going to try to do it slightly more quickly. I think they were all sent out. I hope everyone has them in front of them. I see one person looking a little shell-shocked. So what I'm going to do is the following. I'm going to post it in the chat for those people who might not have it. I just posted a PDF in the chat. I hope that solves the problem for those people who are not who don't have it in front of them. If that is not good enough, I guess I could share my screen, but I'd like to really avoid that, because I would like to be able to see everyone's faces, especially when we're getting into some what I hope will be some real discussion. Being able to see people's faces and facial expressions and hand motions, etc., I think will actually be really helpful. So I'm going to leave it as this. If that doesn't work for anyone, please feel free to message me. So I sent out this sheet, competition in buying, which, by the way, is to be distinguished from competition in selling which is also a thing that to be discussed. If someone has a store, are you allowed to open a store down the block? By the way, generally the answer usually almost always is yes. It's very rare that we would say you are not allowed to from a Torah law perspective. But here we're talking about competition in buying. It starts with this Mishnah in Tractate Kiddushin, which is the tractate that talks about marriage, with regard to one man who says to another, go and betroth so-and-so to me, and the latter went and betrothed her to himself. She is betrothed to the second man. So the second guy was, certainly no friend of the first guy, apparently. He went and married this woman for himself and cut out his friend who was interested in marrying her. In that in and of itself is the law. It works. The person can do that. Again, just because something is a not nice thing to do does not necessarily mean it can't be done in Jewish law. There's lots of things in Jewish law that technically work, but they're obviously not good things to do. A great example of that is punching somebody. It is possible in most situations to go and punch someone else and cause them any other kind of physical harm. It is forbidden. The Torah does not allow us to go and hit someone else, obviously not in cases of self-defense or anything like that, but in a general case, just to go over and person said something not nice to me, and I would go over and hit that person. You're not allowed to do that, but it still hurts the other person. And I would have to make restitution, as we alluded to a little bit a couple of weeks ago, if there was restitution to be made, if damage was done, if I embarrassed the person, all these things we talked about a couple of weeks ago very briefly. So not having done something which is, or I should say, having done something which is not nice does not change the fact that this woman who accepted the marriage proposal, and not just proposal, but the marriage transaction of giving something of value, which she accepted and agreed to be married, that works. In paragraph 2, which we read last time, and I'll just paraphrase really quickly, the Talmud tells us that, yeah, it works, but you are labeled what we call in Hebrew a ramai. A ramai means a deceiver, a deceitful person. If you remember the phrase from the Aggadah from Pesach, where we say, Arami Oved Avi, which literally translates as, it's referring to Lavan, to Laban, the father-in-law of Jacob, and it refers to him as an Aramean, Aram, which literally translates as an Aramean. It's been pointed out that he wasn't actually an Aramean. That's not where he lived. And one of the interpretations that when it says Arami, it actually is kind of a version of the word Ramai, a deceitful person. Lavan, who I often refer to as the worst father-in-law in the history of marriage, was the sort of very paradigm of this deceitful person, a ramai. It's a derogatory term applied to someone who has done something which is not nice. So the Talmud tells us in paragraph 2, again, if you haven't read it yet, you can read it at your leisure, that the Talmud tells us that this person it works, but everyone agrees that this person has acted in a deceitful manner. That's paragraph number 2. Paragraphs 3 and 4 tell 2 stories, which are, which I believe is which is where we ended off last time when we discussed it a little bit. I want to dive back into that a little bit before we go on to the final story, which we'll spend a little bit more time on. Paragraphs 3 and 4, in a nutshell, are the same story, except one is a little bit more emotionally charged than the other because it deals with both marriage and family relationships. Paragraph 3, we have someone who I neglected to mention last time, that he's known as Ravin the Pious. So he was known to be a very pious individual. The Talmud therefore assumes that this guy didn't do something which was egregious. The son of Ravin the Pious appointed Ravin to go and marry a woman, and the guy, Ravin, the pious, who the Talmud acknowledges or identifies as a holy person, goes and marries that woman for himself. The Talmud says, well, 1 second, we're talking about a pious individual. How could he have done that? That's a deceitful act. That's the type of thing which is what you would expect of a ramai, of a deceitful person, not a righteous person, a pious person. So the Talmud explains, well, here's the thing: the woman's family was not willing to let the woman marry the son, only agreed to let her marry the father. And remember, the language here is based on the customs of the time. The language here is not a halach, at this point, is not a halachic statement, it's a cultural statement, where at that time, for a woman, and particularly a young woman, to get married, it was really not in her hands very much at all. Maybe almost not at all, at least culturally speaking. Technically, a woman always had the right to say no, but it's the family is sort of making the decision. If the woman's family says they're not willing to let her marry the son, only the father. So now we understand that Ravin, the pious, did not undertake an inherently deceitful act towards his son. But the Talmud is still not happy. The Gemara asks, well, wait a second. Still, he should have let the son know. He shouldn't, as a lot of us, I think, kind of jumped to when we were going through this. The Shabbat dinner next week probably isn't going to be so comfortable. So he probably should have tried to make things better by first coming and saying, listen, son, they weren't, I tried. They weren't willing to let this woman marry you. They were willing to let her marry me. At least spell it out ahead of time. And the Talmud explains that, well, the reason why Ravin did that was because he was afraid that someone else will come along and marry her. And again, I think this has to be understood, as so many things in the Talmud has to be understood in the context of the culture of the times, where, so to speak, getting a young woman married off, language which is just not, it doesn't fit in our modern sensibilities, our modern lexicon, and it shouldn't. But at that time, the way things was that they were just trying to get her married to somebody. So if someone else comes along, they might just look, because love, relationship, marriage, love or relationships, that wasn't, at least not at the outset, that was not a part of the context or the requirements for beginning a marriage relationship at that time. So maybe someone else is going to come along and betroth her. And so therefore the father didn't want to take that chance. Yeah, it's a great Talmudic example in that it gives us some insight. It's in a lot of ways, but one of them is that, sometimes we need to sort of check our emotions at the door in order to analyze a case. That doesn't mean ignore the emotional aspects, because emotions do play a role as well. I'm not trying to tell people that we should ignore the context of the story or the emotions of the story, but from a legalistic viewpoint, we're trying to understand, like, what's going on here. What is the legal status of what happened? And that's a little bit easier in paragraph 4, which is the very next story that the Talmud tells, where the Talmud tells us that a rabbi, Rabba Bar Chana, who also is known as he himself is known as a righteous person, but even more so, he gave money to Rav. Now, Rav, notice that, of course, you're familiar with the fact that the word Rav just means rabbi. Now, they don't give that title to just anybody. This guy was just not guy. This rabbi was just known as Rav. Like you said, Rav, that you knew who you were talking about. In the modern Orthodox world, if you say the Rav, everybody knows you're talking about Rabbi J.B. Soloveitchik of blessed memory. That's just known. I don't need to tell you what his name. That's the Rav. In other parts in Hasidic courts, you refer to someone as the Rebbe, which is basically just a Yiddishization of the word Rav. I don't need to say who it is. I know who it is. So Rav was a leading sage of the time of the Talmud. Right, he's actually right on the border between the times of the Mishnah and the times of the Talmud. So Rav Bar Chana says to Rav, "I'm giving you money. Please go and buy land for me." And Rav goes, buys it for himself. Says the Talmud again. What's Rav doing? Rav is a great rabbi. What's he doing? He's a righteous person. What's he doing? Going and taking it for himself. If we consider this to be deceitful, so the Gemara answers that this was a particular area, it was inhabited by some sort of violent people, and Rav was treated with respect, and they were willing to sell to him. Rabba Bar Chana, who was a generation younger, they didn't treat with that kind of respect, and they weren't willing to sell to him. Like, this is an exclusive area. We're not necessarily letting just anybody buy in this area, so we're willing to sell to you, Rav. We're not willing to sell to this other person who you're representing. So the Gemara again asks, okay, but Rav should have let Rabba Bar Chana know what was going on, again, so to avoid the appearance of acting in a deceitful manner. And the Gemara gives basically the same answer, that Rav was afraid that someone might come along and buy the land, which was, bottom line, a good opportunity, and so he bought it for himself. So we talked about these cases last week, and I'd like to, I don't know, I hope you've had a chance to review this, to look this over a little bit, but let me put these questions out and let's discuss them, and let's hear what you have to say. Do you feel it's fair for the agent to act on his own behalf in the above instances where, if through no fault of his own, he's unable to complete the transaction on the sender's behalf? Do you consider that to be ethical? In other words, I'm sorry, it's a strangely worded sentence, my apologies. What I basically mean to say is Rav, just in and of itself, just taken in a sort of a vacuum, Rav goes, tries to buy the land for this other rabbi, Rabba Bar Chana, and they won't sell it to Rabba Bar Chana, but they will sell it to Rav. So stop right there. If I asked you just your own opinion, your own sensitivities based on your lifetime and understanding of what's considered fair and what's not considered fair, I'd like to know just sort of what your thoughts are about whether it's an ethical thing to do or not. Yes, Toby, go ahead.
I think that if Rav wanted to buy the land, he should have used his own money.
That is an excellent question, an excellent point. And does anyone have a response to that? Anyone? That's what Toby's really. Let me tell you what Toby just did. You don't understand. We are in the Beis Medrash. We are in the study hall together, the virtual study hall. We are here. We are the Talmudic scholars who are debating this and discussing this issue. What Toby really just did was she asked a question. And more than that, she posed sort of an attack on the story. Like, wait a second, Rav, why are you not using your own money? So what would you respond to that? Anyone ever responds to that to help Rav out in this case? Rav's a good man. We don't want him to come across poorly.
It doesn't say whose money he used.
So that's kind of where I come in also. I would venture to say, now, forgive me, it says Bobby on your screen. Is that an accurate use of, is that your name?
No, that's my wife's name. I'm Jay.
Oh, you're Jay. A pleasure to meet you, Jay. We've had a little email exchange. Good to meet you. So I would agree with Jay. In fact, I would take it a step further. I would say that if Rav had used Rabba Bar Chana's money, I would question whether it actually who it belonged to, because Rav used somebody else's money. It's somebody else's money. You can't use someone else's money. And my working assumption is that Rav must have used his own money to buy it, and then he comes back and returns Rabba Bar Chana his money.
Okay.
That's my assumption. Yes.
The problem is you can use an assumption to let somebody off the hook, but the facts that were given was that Rabbi Bar Hana gave money to Rav. The only way you get Rav off the hook is to assume he had his own secret stash of money. And there's nothing in the story that says that before he acted as the agent, he wanted to buy that land for himself. He was there and he wanted to take advantage of a situation. The only way I can read it is that he did what was necessary at the time to take the advantage, including using money that wasn't his. So the good guy actually comes across as a thief.
So the truth is, and forgive me, I know I don't want to refer to you as Mr. Toby. So
I'm Mark.
Mark?
Yes,
Okay,
and
okay,
Mr. Toby is fine. It's been, we've been,
Either way.
Either way.
So Mark, AKA Mr. Toby, the truth is that what you're bringing up is an essential point when it comes to Talmud study. And there's a couple of points that have to be brought up in order to flesh out what you're talking about. And the truth is that some of it would only be fleshed out by kind of seeing more Talmud in action. But there's a couple of points that we have to keep in mind. Number one is that the Talmud, and it's even more true in the Mishnah, but it's true in the Talmud as well. The Talmud does not fill in every detail in these stories, which were or discussions which were happening and being transmitted orally. It was at the very least an incidental thing. I suspect that sometimes it was not incidental, but it was actually on purpose. The incidental would be there's a story that people heard and was told from one person to the next, and it's kind of, perhaps you might call it broken telephone. I don't want to. I think by calling it broken telephone, it sort of takes away from the significance that was given to these studies. These were case studies that were being discussed in the study hall. So it's not. I don't think it was taken lightly, such that the story might end up just completely wrong, as we know can happen when stories are told over. But on the other hand, not all the details were clearly given over, either incidentally or I suspect often on purpose, because it gives us the opportunity and the necessity to engage with it. Now, the question you'd have to ask, and I don't want to, as time goes on, and I hope we have the opportunity to study more together, and we'll be able to discuss this in other scenarios, in other settings, in other cases. But the question ultimately that one must ask oneself is, why would we want to assume the worst about someone who the Talmud cites, and particularly in the case of Rav, the Talmud cites him often as a very important rabbi of the time. Like, let's try to take away some of the cynicism which has developed for all of us over the last X number of years when it comes to rabbis. And I'm not saying that there isn't place for that, but on the other hand, is it right to assume that Rav was doing something with the intention of being a bad guy? And it seems like the Talmud wants to assume that he was not. Yeah, Mark, you want one more thing, and then I want to move on a little bit.
but it's in a series of stories of an agent who did not act in the best interests, the true interests of the principal. It's in a series of stories in that. regard. It doesn't stand by itself. If it wanted to show Rav as being in the proper light of being an honest, ethical agent, the story very well could have been when he was told they would not sell to him, he said, "Thank you very much," returned home to Hannah and returned his money to him and said, "I'm sorry, but I could not ethically do anything else."
So,
The story
Mark,
about-
it sounds like you're concluding then, to answer that question number one, that Rav, let's grant me the benefit of the doubt for a moment that
Right.
Rav used his own money. Using someone else's money to buy it, that would be, I mean, that's really egregious. That's goes beyond the ethical and to the illegal.
Doesn't say anything.
But let's give me the benefit of the doubt that Rav was acting, was not acting illegally. It sounds like you're of the opinion that Rav's action was unethical. Can I get a yes or no?
Yes,
So are there any dissenters to that? Does anyone feel that Rav was acting ethically?
How do we know that he didn't plan on paying him back when he got back?
That's also true. That's a good point. Good, Harriet. Thank you for giving Rav a little bit of love. Any other additional thoughts about whether if you had to label what Rav did, ethical or unethical, and why? Yes, go ahead. I don't have seen Diana. Yes.
Are we talking before we know all the details or after?
Oh, an excellent question. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Well, when you first hear the story, but you don't know that the land wasn't available to Rabbi Barhana or whoever it was,
Right.
you think, your impression would be he did wrong and it shouldn't be right. It's not right. But then once you know what's going on, it's a little different. It's a lot different.
Right. Okay. Other thoughts along the comments in that range, and then I'll kind of share what I'm thinking. Yeah, is it Jill? That's what it says on your screen.
Yes, that's me. I know there's a fine line between ethical and moral. In some respects, I don't think it was maybe unethical, but I don't think it was very moral. Again, the fact that he bought the land, and especially since they said, we're not going to sell it to the other guy because we don't respect him. This guy's his friend, and so he goes ahead and buys it for himself. It just doesn't seem morally right to me. It's just wrong.
I hear that.
So I have a thought. Is if you put yourself in either man's shoes, you may think a little bit differently. But if I'm Rabba Bar Hana, I ask myself, once I know all the facts, I'm not going to be happy, but should I be mad at Rav? The property wasn't available to me. It just wasn't. No, it wasn't going to be sold to me. Why should I not allow Rav then to take advantage of the opportunity when it wasn't me or him. It wasn't Hana or Rav. The Hana was not going to get the property if these are the facts. Now, why should I, as Rabba Bar Hana, begrudge Rav for taking the opportunity that I wanted for myself?
Okay. Mark, I don't want to let you monopolize the conversation. That's my job. But my own personal leaning happens to go towards, is it Keith? Is that what I should be calling you? Okay, great. And my own personal leaning happens to go towards Keith. It may have to do with, Rav knows Rabba Bar Bar Chana. Maybe he knows that he's a particularly logical and less emotionally charged kind of person, and he knows he's not going to have any hard feelings. I could tell you, by the way, certainly several, probably if I give a little thought to it, dozens of stories of rabbis who went out of their way and gave up their own benefit in order not to have someone else feel bad. And so it becomes very case sensitive. In terms of it's an interesting distinction you draw, Jill, between moral and ethical. But there's room to, there's certainly, I would say that there's room to see it, depending on the entirety of the situation. There's room that it could be one way, it could be the other way. And I think what the Talmudic approach tends to be, we're going to give these rabbis the benefit of the doubt and try to find a way that what they did was appropriate, because not all of the details of the story are necessarily contained in what was told over. Part of what's going on here is meant to be an analysis by us, the students, what was going on here. And so let me figure out how that might make sense. I think I used this, I think I went back to Einstein last time also, but I tend to go to him a lot. Not that I know anything about him, but or certainly about anything that he taught or wrote. But you know, I actually just read a story like this. Supposedly, I mean, it's clearly can't prove that this story is true. Einstein gets up in front of his students and starts writing a series of equations. He writes, let me make sure I got this right. Yes, he goes 1 times 10 equals 10. Series of equations. He goes down in a row. 2 times 10 equals 20. 3 times 10 equals 30, etc. 4 times 10, 5 times 10, 6 times 10, 7 times 10, 70. 8 times 10 equals 80. 9 times 10 equals 91. And his students all explode in like, that's ridiculous, absurd. And the way this story was told over, which in my opinion is maybe a little bit touchy-feely. I'm not sure if it's hard for me to believe this story actually ever happened, but he says back, nobody complimented me on the fact that I got the first 9 right. All you did was jump in and point out that the last one was wrong. So what I actually do take from that story is, if you get the first 9 right, then maybe before I assume the 10th one is wrong, I should give it a little bit of thought. And maybe there's something I'm missing. And that would be like, I would not be the student of Einstein's who's jumping up and saying, what kind of ridiculous thing is that to say? I would be the one who's saying, 1 second, there's got to be a trick here. There's something going on. This man is not an idiot. And I think that's an attitude which is really important in, I think, any sort of study of, really frankly, anything. Whenever you study something of someone whose opinion we feel and whose writings have, make them worth studying, it seems to me only logical to say, let me see if there's something I might be missing here that would actually make this make sense. And that's a lot of what goes on. Certainly it happens in stories, which we happen to be dealing with stories, but it also happens, by the way, in logical arguments, which we're not seeing as much of right this second, where you'll have 2 rabbis, one says X, one says Y. And so now, who's right? Well, as far as I'm concerned, X makes sense. I'm talking here. I'm looking at the Talmud. I see Rabbi so-and-so says X, Rabbi so-and-so other name says Y. Thinking about it, I'm trying to apply my skills of analysis. And you know what? I just don't understand the second rabbi's opinion. It doesn't make sense to me. I just don't get it. Now, there's 2 ways we can approach that. There's 2 things we can do with that, I think. The first one is to say, okay, Rabbi X is right, Rabbi Y is wrong. That would be one thing we could do. I think it would be unfortunate, because maybe if I give it some thought, I'll find that, hey, you know what? I think I'm starting to understand, if I think about it a little more, try to understand where Rabbi Y might be coming from, I'll actually be able to expand my mind and learn something new which I didn't know before. Because let me look at this a little bit differently. And if I start looking at it differently, I start saying, oh, now I understand where Rabbi Y is coming from. Now, if Rabbi Y is someone who I know generally says smart things, and this one here I just don't get, it deserves the respect of, and not just it deserves the respect, more than that. Don't forget about respect. I'm not, that's not, the point is not respect. What it does, it behooves us to spend the time to give that some thought, because otherwise we may just be missing out on a whole perspective, which we would never have considered. And if I can go back to Einstein again, you know, if Albert Einstein and who's the other one I always use? He just died not that long ago. I don't know if they ever met each other. Stephen Hawking. So, you know, if Einstein and Stephen Hawking were having a conversation, and let's say I actually know something about physics, which I do not, but let's say I actually know a little something about physics. I'm listening to this conversation, or perhaps I'm reading a transcript of the correspondence between the two discussing a particular issue. And now I am someone who has studied physics, and so therefore I have some knowledge of what they're talking about, and I'm reading it, and I say, you know what? Einstein makes sense. Hawking's is wrong. Now, you could stop right there and say, okay, Einstein is right, Hawking's is wrong. But you could also consider the fact that, you know, if Hawking was here, he probably would, and forgive the poor humor, run circles around you, you know, in explaining why what he's saying actually is eminently logical. And by the time he was done with you, you would wonder if Einstein knew that 9 times 10 was not 91, because you're dealing with, so there's two ways to look at this, or to deal with it. One would be to say, he seems right, he seems wrong, okay, goodbye. And the other way is, okay, both of these people deserve my intellectual respect, and I have what to learn. Maybe if I work on this, if I think about it some more, if I see if there's other ways, kind of turn it over in my mind and look at it from different angles, maybe I might discover that there's something new that I didn't realize, which will actually get me closer to understanding what's going on here between these two giants, namely the giants I'm referring to of Einstein and Stephen Hawking. From a traditional and from a Talmudic standpoint, that goes like multiplied by 1,000,000 when we go back to our sages who as you study Gemara, as you study Talmud, you start to see more and more that the sheer volume of what these people knew, forget about the depth of their understanding, but the sheer volume of what they knew, just you can't help but be in awe. Like, okay, these are people who are really smart. I don't get this right now, but it certainly behooves me to try to learn, and learn by the juxtaposing the two of them, playing them off of one another. I once, many years ago, heard a rabbi say that, you know, there's lots of people, and we dealt with this a little bit in the second class in particular, second session. Often people look at the Mishnah and Gemara, and they write it off as being, listen, everybody argues with everybody else. The whole thing is one big argument. Like clearly they can't understand what's going on. Why do I need to study this? And that there's a few reasons why I think that's not a smart way of looking at things. But what this rabbi was pointing out was that actually argument, in his words, it would, and I want to put the Hebrew in. I'll translate it just because it for me it resonates more. That he said that machlokes is the brilliant tool which the Amoraim used in order to allow us to see into their discussion. Machlokes, argument, is the tool, that brilliant tool is English, it allows us to be able to get and see what's going on. Because when I see that this rabbi says X, and this rabbi turns and says, you know, I don't agree with that. I think you're wrong on that point. Well, now, by kind of examining the space in between them, where do they agree? Where exactly do they disagree? I get to be a fly on the wall, listening to their discussion and gaining from their and expanding my mind to their closer to their levels of wisdom. Yes, Stephen.
So I have a question along these lines. So I can't pick an example because I don't know the Talmud anywhere like you do, but I'll give you this sort of generalization, and maybe you can tell me if such a situation exists, where the two sages, the Amorim, yeah, back then they were having this discussion, and there was it came to they came to a settlement, if you will, in the Talmud. Sorry, in the Gemara. Yeah.
Which is the same word, same thing.
Yeah, same word. Yeah. It came to an understanding of what became settled law. In other words, what actually became the accepted halacha.
Mhm.
Is there any situation where later on, let's say 2 generations later, you confronted with a new set of facts, such that you realize that it really needed to go the other way?
So I see several possible ways of interpreting more deeply, like the angle that or the question that you're asking. So, and therefore I'm going to choose none of them. No, just because I go back to something which I'm going to start saying more and more. The only way to really get an answer to that question is by learning Gemara. And fortunately, we have the opportunity to do that. And I think we're not going to get the answer to everything as you know, in the 4 sessions that we have now, or God willing, where if people choose that we want to continue, then we continue. Whatever, it takes time. You know, a little some patience is necessary, and we can discuss it further. I'm always happy to have a cup of coffee.
And also, is there a situation where the answer doesn't become settled? In other words, there isn't a definitive situation. Let's say we take the case of maybe it's modesty, sinut, where it may vary by community, to some extent by community standard. And because I'm looking for analogies in science, because that's the place where I'm fundamentally way more comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
You know, where for
that's
example,
why I want to stay in Talmud, because it's where I'm fundamentally
right. So you know, because for example, in the early part of the 20th century, you know, Einstein and others argued about what's called spooky action at a distance. I won't go into the details, right? But today that we know observationally, in other words, you can do experiments and you can show that Einstein's uncomfortableness was wrong, and the results of the mathematics that were proposed by the folks who were into quantum mechanics turned out to be correct. In other words, the thing that they calculated, which so troubled Einstein, which he resisted, right, later on is now shown to be a truth. And so I'm just wondering, you know, because you gave a good, by the way, I really appreciate your example, because I think there's a lot to be said for that analogy, because sometimes the differences of disagreement are fairly subtle. Yes. And the folks who aren't really close to the topic can't really weigh in. You know, it's hard for them to weigh in. But I'm just curious about if the analogy can be drawn further, where you know, later on it was changed, or it was unsettled and then it became settled later.
So yeah, that's too broad a question for me to be able to answer without preparation. And frankly, it's the type of thing which is it's almost you know, something to keep in mind as one goes through Talmud study, because what happens is, you know, we have to live with studying Talmud, just like studying really any other challenging field. You have to be able to embrace a certain amount of ambiguity and a certain amount of unclarity, that you just have to kind of be able to, however you deal with that tension, whether it's, you know, okay, I'm just not going to think about that right now, or you just, you know, I don't know, whatever metaphor you use, you know, you put it on the shelf, you know, pickle it and come back to it. It's the type of thing that there are things that that are not, I don't have there are people who are a lot smarter than I am. And it's hard for me to acknowledge, but it's so blatantly obvious as to be ridiculous. And who could, I think, would do a better job with that question, sort of standing on one foot. But we'll see more as we go along.
Okay.
I do want to touch on the Aggadah tonight, so that I don't make a complete liar out of myself, who said that we were going to be doing Aggadah. And so what I would like to do is go to this final case. Okay, unfortunately, at this point, we really just I don't see where we have time to, again, we don't have time to get into the long case that's in number 5. Will be more than happy to give it to lead another. Well, again, we'll see what happens. I'll be more than happy to get back together and come back to this case number 5 and this whole discussion. And frankly, before we move on to talking about the Aggadah, what we're really doing here, and in this case, we're doing it in stories. A lot of times the Talmud does it not necessarily in stories, but in more logical arguments, more theoretical arguments. What we're really doing here is laying out the principles of ethical behavior, or a set of principles of ethical behavior. So, for example, in this story, and actually both of these two stories, both the one involving marriage and the one involving the land, I think there's one thing we see pretty clearly. The Talmud feels that, actually there's two things, two sides of a coin that we see pretty clearly. One is that in spite of the fact that Rav, who bought the land, was not actually doing anything wrong to Rabba bar Chana, he was not, because as Keith pointed out, it's not him who is stopping Rabba bar Chana from buying the land. He's perhaps being, he's being opportunistic, but not at the expense of Rabba bar Chana, because Rabba bar Chana is not getting it anyway, right? So he's if we could call that from a strictly ethical sense, not a violation, the Talmud says, wait a second, but you know what? Even though technically you're not harming Rabba bar Chana, you should have gone to him and made it that he'll understand more easily, because as we all know, hearing it after the fact and having, Rav comes riding up on his horse or donkey or whatever, holding the deed of the land with his name on it, and he said, "Listen, Robert, it's not what it seems like." It's a much harder discussion, perhaps, than if you were to come ahead of time and say, "Listen, they've decided that they don't want to sell to you. Now, I would like to buy the land. They're not offering to sell it to you. They will not sell it to you. I tried. They will not sell it to you. I would like to buy the land." That does change the dynamic a little bit between the two of them, and we see from here like a level of I think, to use the language that Jill used, which I kind of like here, is the moral thing to do is to spell that out ahead of time. It is the right thing to do. Rav should have taken the effort to assuage Rabba bar Chana ahead of time. And the Talmud feels that Rav's a great man. He wouldn't have. Why did he do that? That's a question. I don't understand why. What made him decide to do that? So that right there has already told us something. That in a situation where I have the opportunity, where I'm not harming him technically, but you know what? He's going to feel bad. And if I talk to him ahead of time, it'll help make him feel better. That I have a responsibility, at least on a moral or a sort of a righteousness level. It is an appropriate thing to do for me to not make, to do it in a way that will not make him, give him that moment of feeling bad. That's step one. And what's interesting is step two, where the Talmud says, well, yeah, but he was concerned that he was going to lose out. And apparently the Talmud feels that that losing out on a piece, on an opportunity is enough reason for him to not go ahead, take that extra step of going and giving him a heads up ahead of time. Now it's a very interesting dynamic, those two sides, where on the one hand, morally, or from a perspective of what's the right thing to do, what is the nice thing to do, it behooves Rav to try to solve that, to be nice. On the flip side, sometimes there are opportunities which are important enough that the niceness can be, in certain situations, can be dispensed with because of the exigency of that situation. Now, it would, to apply that in actual practice, from this one story, would be foolish, because there's a million reasons why this situation might be different. I don't know anything about that piece of land. I don't know about what Rabbi Bar Chana's relationship with Rav was. I don't know, how great an opportunity it was for Rav. All sorts of things that I don't know. So if I wanted to extrapolate from here to somewhere else, it wouldn't be so simple to do. But as an overarching idea, we certainly see that the Talmud feels that Rav, barring any extenuating circumstances, it would have behooved him to not take the opportunity right now. First, put in the effort to go and make sure that Rabbi Bar Chana is not going to feel bad. There's a let me just remember the story correctly. So in late 19th century Eastern Europe, there were 3 sisters who were married to 3 great rabbis. That's probably wasn't an uncommon occurrence, but there are 3 that I'm referring to in particular. And it was actually a family, the name of the family of these sisters, their name was Frank. Actually, another relative of this family ended up as the chief rabbi of Jerusalem for a period of time. He was Rabbi Tzvi Pesach Frank, and all this is all part of the same rabbinic family. So there were these 3 brothers-in-law who had married, each one married one of these 3 sisters, who all were great scholars. But here was the interesting thing, was that I'm sorry, 2. There were 2 brothers-in-law and 2 sisters that are part of this story. I think there may have been a 3rd one, but that is not part of the story. One of the brothers-in-law was a man named Rabbi Isser Zalman Meltzer. Name may or may not ring a bell. He was a very important leader both in Europe and then afterwards in Israel in the early part of the 20th century. And the other one's name escapes me, because you see what happened was that this other sister was engaged to a particular young man, and the parents were wealthy people, and they were very intent on making sure that their daughters married great scholars. Like they had it was something that was very important to them. They, which was somewhat unusual for the time, had the money to be able to support and help their sons-in-law be able to grow into great Torah leaders, and they wanted their daughter to marry a great Torah leader. This young man who was nameless at this point, just because I don't remember his name, the mother of this young woman got the impression that the young man was not as diligent in his studies as they wanted. Why? Because he offered once to come and help in the store. Say, if you need help, I'd be willing to, I'd be happy to come and help you. So that made the mother decide, okay, we're breaking off this engagement, because he obviously does not take his studies seriously. I'm not judging the mother's decision making, but listen to what happens next. So they break off the engagement. The daughter marries another person named Rabbi Moshe Mordechai Epstein. Rabbi Epstein was apparently fit that he wasn't a rabbi yet, but young Moshe Mordechai Epstein was apparently met the level of diligence that this family was looking for, and they get married. So they've broken off the engagement and get married. Several years later, Rabbi Meltzer had become the head of one of the major yeshivos, one of the major seminaries for Talmud and Torah study in Europe, which was in a little town called Slobodka, which was a suburb of Kovna, which is now known as Kaunas in Lithuania. It was it was probably one of the most important yeshivos in terms of the impact on the future Torah world, maybe the most important one in Lithuania at the time. And they wanted to hire a second Rosh Yeshiva to assist this Rabbi Meltzer, and the name came up of this person who had been engaged to his sister-in-law and now had been broken off and had broken it off. And so that the head of the person who was doing the hiring suggested, let's take this person. And Rabbi Meltzer said, no, we can't do that. Why? Because if we take him, then my mother-in-law is going to feel like, here I turned down this match and broke the engagement, and now he, who apparently was a rather diligent student, and I guess he was just also conscientious about wanting to help people, it turns out that he becomes the head of this yeshiva together with me, the brother-in-law. Like it would break my mother-in-law's heart. Instead, let's take the brother-in-law, the one who actually did marry my sister-in-law, and that was what they did. The other fellow did just fine. I don't remember, again, I know his name is known, and I just don't remember right now. He did just fine for himself. But it's a fact, like it's, if not exactly comparable to what we're talking about here, there's a certain level of similarity where there's a sensitivity that, is there anything wrong with, hey, this is the person who we think will be the best person? Okay, that's true, but you're going to hurt someone's feelings by doing that. And if you take this other person who was also qualified, he just wasn't the one that they had chosen first, that'll be a better solution because of the concern for this woman's feelings, which is a little bit what we're seeing over here. It's hard to legislate and apply, how that would apply in sort of legally speaking, but a little bit of what we're seeing over here. Okay. I want to spend the next little bit, the last bit of time that we have for tonight, talking about the subject of Aggadah. Now, if you happen to have in front of you, I'm just going to pull it up. So I shared this with you. I sent it out in an email. And by the way, I now cannot see everybody's faces. So please just yell out if you have something you want to add or say. We've looked at this schematic. It can come across as somewhat intimidating, but I think that we've kind of walked through. We have the written Torah and the oral Torah, and it's pretty cool how we've walked through the written Torah, oral Torah, most of the categories of the oral Torah, with the notable exception. But the note. Come on. Okay. Well, the one that's not highlighted, with the notable exception of the one which is not highlighted, we've talked about many of these categories of the oral Torah. We talked about how that was categorized in the Mishnah, and then it was further explained in the Talmud. We talked a little bit about the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, mostly about the Babylonian Talmud, the Talmud Bavli, and the section and the different topics that are covered there, explanations of the Mishnah, legal decisions from the Mishnah, new legislation we talked about. We again have not talked about this Aggadah. We'll get back there in 1 second. Just to finish a little bit of review, we talked about the fact that there are several generations, which really goes all the way down to today, generations of sages of different eras who dealt with explaining the writings of the generation or generations before them. And each generation then goes and explains and works on understanding the writings of the people before them. We talked about the fact that there has been more codification of the laws that come out of the Talmud. In 4C here, the Code of Jewish Law. We talked about that, which is in Hebrew, the Shulchan Aruch, the set table, which lays out the laws in more sort of exacting detail, more like a proper law book, if you will. We haven't talked, and that's all essentially legal. Although you may have noticed, or I'll point out, when we say legal, we've also talked tonight about ethical and moral, and I would argue, and I'm not sure that there aren't other people who would strongly disagree with me, but I would argue that from a Torah perspective, ethics and halacha, Jewish law, there's at most a very fine line between them, if there's a line at all. We talk much less about ethics from a Talmudic scholarly perspective, and much more about what does the law require, including what does the law require if what I'm about to do is going to make somebody feel bad. Am I allowed to do that or not? Which is what we might refer to as a moral or ethical question. It can also be framed as a sort of a halachic question. It's a halachic question which has so many myriad details that it would be difficult to point to something and say, yes, this is a clear indication of what I should do here. We have a basic, it gives us a basic concept of these of moral and ethical principles as well. What we have not talked about very much, basically at all, is what's referred to over here in section 2 as the philosophic component of the oral Torah, known as the Aggadah. It's written here as Aggadah, which is the Aramaic version. In Hebrew, it's Aggadah. That ta on the end, Aggadah, is a function of Aramaic. Oftentimes, the only difference between Aramaic and Hebrew is that ta on the end. So, a tractate in Hebrew is a masechet. In Aramaic, it's a masechta. Same word. Just okay. So we have Aggadah, otherwise known as Aggadah, the philosophic component of the oral Torah, And if you kind of go down a little bit, I'm going to skip over the Zohar, which is Kabbalah, the mysticism, which I know absolutely nothing about, or extremely, even less than I do about other things. And if you go down here, we see inside the Talmud Bavli, we have one section, which I had ignored before, called Aggadah, or Aggadah, what we were calling the philosophic component. And that's part of the Talmud. It also, by the way, appears in the Midrash. The Midrash Aggadah, which is not the name of a book, but a category of books, which includes things like Midrash Rabbah, that's a set of books of Midrash, the Midrash Tanchuma, which is another set of books of Midrash. There's a lot of different sets of books, which are Midrashim. So they're writings by mostly people of the Talmudic era, what we refer to as Amoraim or an Amora. But it's not halachic. It is philosophic. It is stories. It is backstories, oftentimes, to things that the Torah alludes to but does not tell us explicitly. And sometimes, and I know there are some people with, we have a variety of levels or of amounts of background that people have in Jewish studies and in Talmud studies, but it can range from the logical to the absolutely bizarre in terms of what some of these what the stories might be about. So you'll have you'll have a discussion in the Midrash, Cain. I always, for some reason I always get this wrong. Cain killed Abel, right? I think so. Cain, yeah, Cain does. Okay, I can't see everybody's faces, but I'm pretty sure Cain killed. For some reason, I have like a mental block. I gotta get it straight. The Torah very briefly alludes to a conversation between the two of them before Cain kills Abel, but it doesn't tell us what the conversation is. It says Cain said to Abel, his brother, and then they were in the field and he killed him. And it doesn't say what it was that he said. So the Midrash fills in what it is that Cain said to Abel. That's more of a of something which, okay, that's easy enough for us to wrap our heads around. But it can go to things which sort of defy our ability to accept. The Talmud tells us something you may have, I'm sure some of you have certainly heard. The Talmud tells us that God held Mount Sinai over the heads of the Jewish people and said, if you accept the Torah, great. If you don't, I'm going to drop the mountain on you. Now, is that meant to be understood as something that literally happened or not? That's one step. I'll take even a step further. The Talmud tells us elsewhere that the sun each day describes the Earth's, I guess, atmosphere, you might say, or this air around the Earth as a box. And it says that the sun, at the end of the day, it pops out of one side of the box as like an opening. And overnight, it goes around to the other side. And then it comes back in the other side and it starts all over again, which is clearly completely not in line with what we know to be true at this time, that we're, now we're able to observe what's going on. And so that we have something which just comes across as being somewhere between absurd and archaic, or some combination of both. The Talmud describes Pharaoh of Moses and Egypt fame as being 1 cubit tall. A cubit is somewhere between 18 and 24 inches. Differences of opinion how much a cubit is. So does that mean that Pharaoh was actually somewhere between 18 and 24 inches tall? It boggles the imagination to consider that. It tells us, we're told that Moses stood 10 cubits high. Now 10 cubits, let's take the easy math. 10 cubits at 24 inches per cubit would make him 20 feet tall. And the Talmud says, or the Midrash, I forget if it's in the Midrash or in the Talmud, but it's the same idea, that the Talmud says that we are taught that Moses stood 10 amos tall. His stick was 10 amos tall. He jumped 10 amos in the air, and he hit Og, the giant king of Bashan, who was someone that the Jewish people faced at the end of their time in the desert, hit him on his ankle, which makes Og, first of all, really, really, really big, and it makes Moshe really, really big. 20 feet. It seems impossible. Even having him jump 10 amos tall seems impossible. So it's quite common for the Talmud or the Midrash, and again, in this case, let's put it all under the category of Aggadah, to tell things that seem either absurd or, based on what we know now, downright just absolutely just wrong. And at the very least, things that push the limits of imagination as to whether it's possible that these things are true. That's I think anyone, and forgive me for not bringing more specific examples and showing you inside in the Talmud. I apologize. My week did not play out exactly as I had intended, and probably I have a little bit of a Freudian block against this whole thing. I'll explain why in a moment. What do we do with all that? What do we do with I mean, you know, I want to give the Talmud the benefit of the doubt. I've been talking about that for the better part of the last little more, actually more than an hour. I want to give the Talmud the benefit of the doubt, but there are things that are just doesn't make any sense, and for that matter are wrong, are based on facts that have been long debunked. Talmud talks about a type of a microscopic insect that spontaneously generates out of nothing. That's just not something that we have. It's just not true, and we have. So, and what do we do with that? So, the answer to all of this is somewhat vague. Not vague. It I guess is maybe in everything in Judaism. It depends. And hang on, I really want to see everybody's faces right now, so I'm going to do that. The answer to this is okay. The answer to this is, as many things in Judaism and in everything, it depends. And what I mean by it depends is the following. Rabbis, commentaries have written for going all the way back to the medieval commentaries, and then going from there, have discussed these very issues. Like, what do we do with the fact that we have things that just seem like they're very difficult to understand, and things that are based on science that we don't, that we know not to be, that we know at this point not to be true. And the most comprehensive understanding that I have come across is that of Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, who is an Italian. I may have mentioned him, I think, in the first session. He was an Italian rabbi and Kabbalist who lived in the early part of the 18th century, 1700s. And he says the following. He says that there were besides for giving over the legal discussion that the Talmud that the rabbis wanted to give over, they also wanted to be able to put into the books of the Talmud and the Midrash the deep philosophical ideas that were part of the oral Torah. However, because of the great profundity and difficulty to understand, and that deep issues contain, they didn't want to just sort of write things out in a very clear way. And so they very often use metaphors to be able to give over concepts that will be more challenging for us to come across, for us to understand. And so that this was their way of sort of keeping the most profound of the deep theological and mystical philosophical teachings, keeping the access to them really limited to people who were taught how to have access to them, and who gained an understanding through learning from their teacher, who learned from their teacher, who learned from their teacher. So that if we talk about the Pharaoh being one cubit tall, that doesn't necessarily mean that he was literally 1 cubit tall. It would have been understood that by some, although there are those who say that particular thing should be understood literally, which is an interesting. That's why I say it depends. But others would say that no, that's not meant to be understood literally. It's meant to be understood figuratively. It refers to the fact that Pharaoh, for all of his bluster, was really, had really poor self-esteem. And while he acted like he was in power, deep down he saw himself as being very small. And to be honest, I said, maybe the reason why I've been delaying talking about this is because I have sort of a bit of a Freudian block. And what I mean to say is I don't know too much about a lot. The Aggadah is the hardest parts of the Talmud, and I was fortunate to spend a lot of time learning the legal parts of the Talmud. When we would get to the philosophical or the stories of it, especially when we got to things that just were clearly just bizarre, we would either skip it or read through it very quickly, and just because it's not an area of study that we were learning. It really wasn't. I just don't, I think that, and for that reason, I tend to be extremely conservative when it comes to interpreting things in the Talmud, which seem to be bizarre. There is many people who talk about that piece of Talmud that I described about the sun popping out one side and coming out and popping back in the other side, which clearly is not how the sun works. Sun doesn't move, as far as I know. But there are writers. The Maharal of Prague, Rabbi Yehuda Lowy of Prague, is one who does a lot of writing about explaining what's going on here. What is the deep philosophical meaning that's happening with these pieces with these teachings, which seem at times to be bizarre. And so metaphor and analogy is a lot of what's going on in these areas where we come across something which seems to boggle which challenges our ability to accept that something is true. If something looks like it's just bizarre, there's a very good chance that it actually is not meant to be understood literally. Not always, because we do, it is certainly a part of the Jewish tradition that there is such a thing as miracles, and things happen that we aren't always able to explain or understand. That definitely is true. And there are things that are listed in the Midrash and in the Aggadah in the Talmud, which may seem like hard for us to accept, but that does not mean they didn't happen. But there's also lots of things that are listed there that are really just meant as allegory. The rabbis used, and as well, the rabbis used often, at times at least, used the science of the times as a vehicle for that allegory, which it didn't matter if the science was right or wrong. They're not making a statement that the science is right, because they don't care about the science. What they're getting at is what the allegory is coming to teach us. They're not there the science is just a vehicle that they are using to give over a particular idea. And that is it's something, as maybe you can hear in my voice, like, I definitely I wouldn't say I have trouble with it. It's challenging for me to accept that there's a whole area of the Torah that is sometimes I'm not sure what's meant to be literal, and not just me. Rabbis, rabbis of stature will argue about whether something is meant to be understood literally or not. Sometimes we have writings of earlier sages who talk about it and explain what's going on here. And sometimes, because after all, this is the Talmud, we have two rabbis who talk about the same piece of Talmud and draw completely different conclusions about what the Talmud is actually trying to say. And what do you do with that? The answer is very simple. If this rabbi is reliable, then the lesson he's teaching me may or may not be what the Talmud is trying to say, but it's certainly what he's trying to say. It's certainly what he thinks the Talmud could be saying. And if the other rabbi has a completely different take on this understanding, on this very same piece of Talmud, that also is a potentially valid understanding, which means that the lessons that can be drawn from it are worthy of our study, even if I don't know whether that's exactly what the author of the Talmud meant when he was writing it. If I'm looking through the eyes of someone who's reliable, whose opinion I value and trust, then his interpretation is worth understanding because of the lesson that comes from his interpretation. That is a very, not nearly doing justice to the concept of Aggadah. In my own study, like I said, I focus mostly on the halachic, on the things that we can analyze and break down and work with, and are not dressed in allegory and hints. But you can't study Torah as a whole without midrash. You just can't, because the stories in the Torah themselves don't have enough information without us using the midrash to tell us what actually happened. And if we take the interpretations of the midrash of what happened back then, well, then I'm getting a valid interpretation. If I take someone's interpretation of what happened back then who doesn't have the kind of background, I'm getting a different kind of interpretation. Is it right? Is it wrong? That the lessons that that person is teaching me are as valuable as the knowledge and understanding of that person. And that's valid too. Or it's as valid as whatever I ascribe to that particular person. I apologize for ending on such a vague, nebulous sort of a thing, but if there are questions, I'm happy to discuss them. And I will mention that I think you're going to be getting I've talked with Beata, with whom we're going to send out a little survey to discuss. I've heard that there are some people who, at least before this last 20-minute rambling, might be interested in continuing to study together, and I'm open to looking if there's a way for us to do that. So I think you'll be getting a a survey to kind of look at what the options, what would work for you, and we'll do our best to try and meet everyone's needs as best as possible. But if anyone has any questions about this or anything that's been going on, the floor is open.
Thank you, Rabbi. I really enjoyed your class. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you very
you so
much.
much.
Thank you for joining.
So if we were to continue in the future, would it, recalling what you just said about Aggadah, would that not be part of future discussions, or what would be the framework for future discussion? Do you know at this point?
There's a bunch of different directions it could go in, and
Okay.
I'm open to. I'm open to studying Aggadah as long as we as long as we know that there's. I mean, it's a yeah. I'm open to doing
Okay.
that. I as a as a teacher, as someone who wants to have everyone get as much out of Talmud as possible, I
Sure.
would encourage everyone to not focus exclusively on Aggadah, but that doesn't mean that we can't include that as part of what's going on as well. And you know, I want to hear from everyone what works. And I am only one person, which is a shame, because if I was two people, I'd be two average sized people. It'd be much better, but I am not. So you know, there's a limit. We'll have to see what we can work out. But I started this very much with, and I think this was Rabbi Alter's intention as well, very much for it to be something that gives people the opportunity to continue to study. And there's an entirety of the Talmud that it's accessible, it's available, and I want to help make it available for anyone who wants to drink of its waters, if I may wax poetic.
Cool.
And also talk about Harriet's background.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a wonderful night, and we will be in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome. Have a good night.
Rabbi,
Yes, Jay.
I wanted to give you my opinion of an answer to a question you didn't get to. And then
Okay.
I'd just like you to tell me that I'm right. We can save time if you tell me that now, or,
But then I won't get to hear it.
oh, all right, I'll try to be brief because it's late. You ask if the ethics affected by whether it is a case of marriage or a case of acquiring property. Are the ethics different? That was your question number 2
Mhm.
under competition and buying.
Right.
Here's my brief answer. Using an expression you might say, I would say ein kashya, because if I remember correctly, Kiddushin begins with the 2 words ha'isha nikneit, meaning a woman is acquired. And that's the way it was thought of in those days, right?
I think that's a
Yeah,
bit
yeah.
of a generalization, but I see where you're going. Yeah. Okay.
That was it. That was my opinion.
So you'd say it's the same.
Yes, yes. Because they're
So,
both talking about acquiring property.
well, I don't think that it is correct to say that it was seen as acquired. Women were not seen as property. When you really look at the way things were, I'm not saying that women had the type of equality that they are approaching now, or that that the culture was anything like it is now. But there, just from a legalistic standpoint, it clearly was not actual acquisition. But there was something transactional going on, and that's kind of what I was getting at the question, I would say. So you can treasure this moment. I would say that you're right, that from a strictly legal
Thank you.
standpoint, they're the same.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, no one else has heard you say that, so
Well, it's recorded. So if I don't, the recording is on my computer, so it may never see the light of day, but very good. Jay, you clearly got some Torah study background. Can I ask what your background, where it comes from?
never really studied it formally, just whenever, well, when Rabbi Panich started, are you familiar with Rabbi Panich? He used to be the rabbi at my synagogue until about 30 years ago when he retired.
Okay.
For Shabbos Mincha, he would have a little study session in Talmud, so I would attend and learn something.
Okay. Okay, very good. I hope we can, it'd be great to try to sort of replicate that in a certain way. Maybe, I don't know if it'll be on Shabbos, because I don't think we live in the
Right,
same neighborhood, but
Right.
yes.
Yeah, Zoom is a problem on Shabbos, obviously.
Yes, yes, it is. And I really hope we can get to studying in person. I don't know where, I have to make sure that I want everyone to feel comfortable from a health standpoint, of course, but
Right.
it's studying by Zoom is just, it's just not the same. It's just not the
Difficult.
same.
I know. I teach at Marquette University, and Zoom is not for me. I do it in person.
Mhm. What do you teach?
Mathematics.
Aha. Okay, well, we're gonna have a
That's
good
why-
time.
Yeah, that's why I'm okay with the shot, but after that, Drash, Remez, Sod, I'm out. No way. I don't understand that.
That's okay. I'm with I'm with you. Okay, wonderful. It's great to make your acquaintance a little bit more. I now have a face to put to the Gabbai J email, and reach out anytime, and we'll be in touch, God willing. I'm looking forward to continuing to study in some
Thank
way.
you.
Have a great night.
Until then,
Okay,
Thank you, son. Thank you, Rabbi.
you too.